Script 1928. Bumpy Johnson's secret meeting with Al Capone that changed organized crime forever. Chicago, Illinois. The morning of November 17, 1928. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped into the Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue, Al Capone's fortress, his command center, the place where America's most feared gangster orchestrated operations worth millions. This meeting defied every convention of how the criminal world functioned. It shattered the unspoken racial barriers that both respectable society and the underworld relied upon. And the details would stay buried for generations, because exposing them would dismantle the carefully constructed racial divisions that kept both worlds operating smoothly. Al Capone was 29 years old, standing at the pinnacle of criminal power. His bootlegging empire generated over $100 million every year. He just survived the bloodiest period of Prohibition's gang conflicts, having eliminated most serious challengers through a level of violence that made him simultaneously America's most dominant and most hunted criminal figure. Yet Capone confronted a dilemma that bullets couldn't solve, a challenge expanding in ways he hadn't foreseen, demanding a solution so radical that when his counselors first mentioned it, Capone had burst out laughing. "You're suggesting I negotiate with a colored gangster. Have you lost your minds?" The gentleman Capone awaited was Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, 23 years old, a Harlem numbers racketeer dispatched to Chicago by Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary queen of policy who commanded Harlem's gambling empire and now faced mounting pressure from Italian mobsters hungry to seize her profitable domain. Jonson had reached Chicago 3 days prior, carrying a proposal so audacious it bordered on suicidal. Harlem's black criminal leadership wanted to strike a bargain with Al Capone himself. They sought to negotiate a territorial division along racial boundaries. They wanted to establish protocols that would halt the turf conflicts decimating both organizations' earnings and drawing unwelcome federal scrutiny. This proposition was extraordinary because it violated the bedrock principle of American organized crime in 1928. White gangsters commanded everything, and black gangsters scraped by in the margins with whatever crumbs the white bosses permitted them to collect. But what transpired in that hotel dining chamber during the next 3 hours would forge a clandestine understanding that would regulate American organized crime for the following 4 decades. It would establish an arrangement between white and black criminal syndicates so effective and so lucrative that both factions would guard the secret even from their own ranks. And it would prove that Capone's supreme talent wasn't brutality. It was identifying when collaboration proved more lucrative than confrontation, even when that collaboration trampled every social convention of segregated America. If you possess the fortitude to hear this account, stay with me. But I caution you, the facts expose a dimension of American organized crime that's been deliberately concealed from history, because acknowledging it would muddy the simplified stories we construct about both the Mafia and about race relations during Prohibition. This narrative examines how Bumpy Johnson traveled to Chicago as an ambassador from Harlem's black underworld, how Al Capone grasped that battling over Harlem's territory would cost more than sharing it, how these two men hammered out an understanding that granted black gangsters independence in their domains in exchange for paying tribute to Italian syndicates and promising not to expand into white-controlled zones. How this covert partnership generated stability that enriched both parties enormously. And how the alliance between Capone and Jonson, one that couldn't be publicly revealed because it would enrage both white society demanding segregation and black communities, resenting any implication that black gangsters were inferior to white criminals, shaped American organized crime in ways historians are only now beginning to comprehend, now that both men are long deceased and the secrets they protected can finally be disclosed. The Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue represented Al Capone's territory. Every staff member drew his wages. Every chamber could transform into a stronghold or an exit route. Every visitor was monitored and assessed for danger. Security surrounding Capone had intensified following multiple murder attempts in 1928, after enemies had tried eliminating him with explosives and firearms. After Capone discovered that being Chicago's most powerful gangster also rendered him the most targeted. So when Bumpy Jonson entered the Lexington Hotel at 9:47 a.m. on November 17, 1928, he was undertaking an exceptional gamble. Jonson was a black gentleman entering a white gangster's headquarters in an epoch when racial separation was absolute, when most Chicago venues refused black customers, when appearing at Al Capone's hotel uninvited would typically culminate in being brutalized or executed rather than receiving an audience. But Jonson wasn't uninvited. He'd been anticipated, granted safe conduct, informed by Capone's agents that he could travel to Chicago to present his offer, and that he'd be permitted to depart alive regardless of whether Capone embraced or dismissed the arrangement. Jonson was accompanied through the hotel by two of Capone's protectors, large Italian gentlemen who remained silent but observed Jonson meticulously, searching for any indication he might carry weapons or plan an assault. Jonson had been inspected twice already, once upon arriving at Chicago's Union Station 3 days earlier, again entering the hotel entrance. He bore no weapons, dressed in a modest yet costly suit marking him as someone possessing resources, and maintained the composed bearing of a gentleman who comprehended he was entirely at the mercy of people capable of killing him instantly, yet believed the potential benefits justified the hazard. The private dining chamber where Capone waited occupied the hotel's 4th floor, was decorated expensively with mahogany furnishings and crystal lighting fixtures, and featured food arranged on a table, Italian cuisine, premium wines, the type of presentation Capone employed to exhibit his prosperity and his welcome. Capone occupied the head position, dressed in one of his trademark custom suits costing more than most men earned annually, and was accompanied by two of his principal counselors, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Capone's financial administrator and the gentleman who managed the syndicate's connections with corrupt politicians and police, and Frank Nitti, Capone's enforcer and the gentleman who addressed problems requiring violence. "Mr. Jonson," Capone announced, rising to clasp hands, a gesture of regard that astonished Jonson because most white gentlemen in 1928 wouldn't clasp hands with black gentlemen regardless of circumstances. "Welcome to Chicago. Please be seated, dine. We're not conducting business on empty stomachs." Jonson seated himself cautiously, maintaining the respectful yet not submissive bearing essential for this gathering. He needed to demonstrate regard for Capone's authority without appearing weak, needed to show that Harlem's black gangsters were legitimate players worthy of negotiating with rather than being dismissed as minor criminals who could be disregarded or destroyed. "Mr. Capone," Jonson commenced, his voice steady despite understanding that the following minutes would determine whether he departed this chamber alive or whether he became another corpse in the Chicago River. "I appreciate your agreeing to meet with me. Madame St. Clair extends her regards and requested me to present a proposition that she believes will advantage both your syndicate and ours." Capone dispensed wine, offered a glass to Jonson, and smiled, not the friendly smile of someone greeting an acquaintance, but the calculating smile of a businessman evaluating a potential transaction. "I'm listening, but I must inform you, when my associates first mentioned Harlem wanted to dispatch someone to negotiate, I presumed it was a jest. You comprehend what you're requesting." "You're requesting me, Al Capone, who commands Chicago, who maintains agreements with every major family from New York to Kansas City, to strike a bargain with colored gangsters. You know how that appears." "I comprehend precisely how it appears," Jonson stated, meeting Capone's gaze directly, not retreating. "It appears you're intelligent enough to identify when collaboration is more lucrative than confrontation. It appears you grasp that battling over Harlem will drain more resources than you'll ever extract from conquering it. And it appears you're the one boss in this nation who possesses the courage to execute what makes business logic, even when it contradicts what everyone anticipates. The chamber fell silent. Guzik and Nitti stared at Jonson, apparently stunned that this young black gangster was addressing Al Capone so directly, that he was challenging Capone rather than deferring to him. This was the instant when Jonson would either earn Capone's regard or would provoke his own death for disrespecting America's most powerful gangster. Capone stared at Jonson for several extended seconds. Then he chuckled, a genuine chuckle that dissolved the tension. "I admire you," Capone declared. "You possess courage entering here and addressing me like that. Acceptable, Mr. Jonson. Inform me what Harlem's offering and, more significantly, inform me what Harlem believes I should extract from this bargain. Because you're correct that battling over Harlem would be costly, but you're mistaken if you believe I can't prevail in that battle. So convince me why I should negotiate, instead of simply seizing what I desire." Jonson reached into his jacket pocket slowly, extracted a document, and positioned it on the table. "This is a detailed financial analysis of what Dutch Schultz and the other white bosses are expending attempting to muscle into Harlem's numbers racket. They're expending approximately $50,000 monthly on enforcers, on bribes, on the violence they're employing to attempt forcing Madame St. Clair and the other Harlem operators out. And after 6 months of this conflict, what have they achieved? They've eliminated some of our people. We've eliminated some of theirs, and they still don't command any significant percentage of Harlem's action." Capone retrieved the document, examined it, handed it to Guzik, who studied it more thoroughly. "Now," Jonson continued, "envision instead that you negotiate. Harlem's policy operations generate approximately $20 million annually. That's after overhead, after compensating cops, after all costs. What if we proposed you 20% of that, $4 million yearly, in exchange for you utilizing your influence to prevent Dutch Schultz and the other bosses from attempting to conquer our territory? That's $4 million in profit costing you nothing except instructing other white gangsters to avoid Harlem. Compare that to expending $50,000 monthly to wage a conflict that you might eventually win, but that'll require years, and that'll attract federal attention none of us desire." Guzik glanced up from the document. "He's accurate about the calculations, Al. $4 million yearly is more than we're extracting from most of our operations, and it's clean revenue. We don't need to execute anything except maintain the peace." "But there's more," Jonson stated, and this was where the proposition became truly extraordinary. "Madame St. Clair comprehends that compensating tribute to your syndicate makes logic. We're not challenging your authority. We're not requesting to be equal associates. But what we are requesting is independence in our territories. You permit us to manage Harlem. You permit us to manage the colored neighborhoods in other municipalities, and will compensate you 20% of gross profits annually. That provides you income from territories you're not currently extracting anything from, provides you influence over colored gangsters across the nation, and costs you nothing except preventing other white bosses from initiating conflicts in territories where we're already established." Capone reclined in his chair, contemplating. The proposition made business logic. $4 million annually from Harlem alone, plus percentages from black-controlled gambling and numbers operations in other cities, could total $10 to $15 million yearly, with essentially zero effort or hazard on Capone's part. But the social implications were staggering. "You know what you're requesting," Capone stated quietly. "You're requesting me to incorporate colored gangsters into the national syndicate. You're requesting me to inform every Italian boss in the nation that they must honor agreements with black criminals, that they can't simply seize what they desire from colored neighborhoods. You're requesting me to transform how the entire underworld functions." "Yes," Jonson stated simply, "that's precisely what we're requesting, and were prepared to compensate for it. What transpired next was what rendered this gathering legendary. The twist that would remain concealed for decades, that would transform both men's existences, and that would alter the framework of American organized crime permanently. Capone rose, proceeded to the window overlooking Michigan Avenue, and remained silent for nearly a minute, while everyone in the chamber waited to observe whether he'd embrace or dismiss the proposition. Then Capone pivoted back to face Jonson and stated something that stunned everyone in the chamber. "I embrace your bargain, but not for the reasons you presume. I'm not embracing because the revenue makes logic, though it does. I'm embracing because I've been contemplating for months about the identical thing you're proposing. And you appearing here informs me that the most intelligent colored gangsters in the nation are contemplating the same direction I am. And when intelligent people on different factions of a conflict reach the identical conclusion independently, that means the conclusion is probably accurate." Jonson stared at Capone, not comprehending. "Here's what I determined," Capone continued. "This prohibition situation isn't persisting indefinitely. Perhaps 10 more years, perhaps fewer. The government's going to realize they committed an error. They're going to abolish the 18th Amendment. And when that transpires, bootlegging is finished. Every syndicate in the nation will forfeit its primary income source, and we'll all be scrambling to discover new rackets to compensate the difference." Capone returned to the table, seated himself, and gazed directly at Jonson. "The future of organized crime isn't bootlegging. It's gambling. It's narcotics. It's labor racketeering. It's all the enterprises that'll still be illegal after prohibition terminates. And you know what I've discovered? The colored neighborhoods operate the finest numbers operations in the nation. Harlem's policy game is more sophisticated than anything the Italians are executing. Madame St. Clair and the other colored operators possess systems we could learn from. So here's my proposition," Capone stated. "Yes, you compensate us 15%, not 20%. I'm reducing the tribute because I desire cooperation, not just revenue. In exchange, I desire Madame St. Clair to dispatch her 3 finest numbers operators to Chicago for 3 months to instruct our people how she manages her operation. And you, Mr. Jonson, you remain in Chicago as my personal liaison to Harlem. You'll reside here. You'll learn how I operate. And you'll be the individual who coordinates between my syndicate and the colored syndicates across the nation. We're constructing something novel here, a national framework where everyone possesses their territory, where everyone compensates their tribute, where everyone honors the agreements, and where we all extract more revenue than we're extracting battling each other." The chamber fell silent again. What Capone was proposing was revolutionary. The creation of a genuinely integrated, though hierarchical, criminal syndicate at a moment when American society was rigidly segregated, when most white people wouldn't even occupy the same table with black people, when the concept of white and black gangsters collaborating was inconceivable. "If I consent to this," Jonson stated slowly, "if I remain in Chicago and collaborate with you, what transpires when people discover? What transpires when the Italian bosses in New York hear that Al Capone has a colored gangster functioning as his liaison? What transpires when colored folks in Harlem hear that Bumpy Jonson is functioning for a white gangster?" Capone smiled. "That's the elegant aspect. Nobody discovers. This understanding remains concealed. Publicly, you're just another gentleman functioning in my syndicate. We don't advertise that you're coordinating with colored gangsters across the nation. We don't inform the Italian bosses precisely what the understanding is. We simply inform them we've developed arrangements that halt the conflicts in colored neighborhoods and that generate income for our syndicate. And in Harlem, you inform people you negotiated independence, that you compelled the white bosses to retreat, that colored gangsters can operate independently as long as they compensate reasonable tribute. Everyone preserves dignity. Everyone obtains what they desire, and the genuine understanding remains between us." Jonson gazed at Capone. At Gusick, at Nitty, comprehending he was being presented something extraordinary. The opportunity to help shape national organized crime policy, to protect black gangsters across the nation from being crushed by white mobs, to construct something that could outlast prohibition and could furnish framework for decades. "I need to consult Madame St. Clair," Jonson stated. "This is larger than what she dispatched me here to negotiate. I require her approval before I can consent to remain in Chicago." "Naturally," Capone stated. "Contact her. We'll provide you privacy. But Mr. Jonson, you inform Madame St. Clair this. Al Capone is presenting partnership, not merely protection. We're presenting to construct something together that's larger than Harlem, larger than Chicago, something that can render all of us wealthier and safer than we are now. And you inform her this proposal is valid for 1 week. After that, I revert to permitting Dutch Schultz and the others to battle over Harlem, and we observe who prevails because I can wait. I possess time and resources, but Harlem doesn't possess time, so she needs to determine rapidly." The stakes in the Capone-Jonson negotiation extended far beyond the immediate question of who would command Harlem's gambling operations. At stake was the fundamental framework of American organized crime, whether it would remain fragmented along racial and ethnic boundaries with constant violence, or whether it could be reorganized into a more stable and more lucrative arrangement that acknowledged racial boundaries but established mechanisms for collaboration across those boundaries. The business implications, the financial stakes, were enormous. Harlem's policy operations generated approximately $20 million annually in the late 1920s, rendering the neighborhood's numbers racket more lucrative than many legitimate enterprises, rendering it territory worth battling for, but also rendering it costly to conquer through violence. The cost of violence was escalating. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters were expending hundreds of thousands monthly on the conflict for Harlem, were losing personnel, were attracting police attention, and were making minimal progress toward actually commanding the territory. The alternative revenue source Capone proposed, receiving 15 to 20% of black-controlled gambling operations across the nation, could generate 10 to 15 million annually with minimal cost or hazard, furnishing stable income that would continue even after prohibition terminated. The knowledge transfer about numbers operations could improve Italian gangsters' gambling rackets, rendering them more efficient and more lucrative, potentially generating additional millions in revenue from improved operations in Italian-controlled territories. From a pure business perspective, Capone's proposal made enormous logic. More revenue, less violence, more stability, superior long-term prospects. But the social implications were staggering. Racial segregation was absolute in 1928 America. Most white people refused even basic social equality with black people, wouldn't dine at the same tables, wouldn't utilize the same facilities, wouldn't accept black people as anything approaching equals in any sphere of existence. The criminal underworld reflected this segregation. White gangsters commanded the most lucrative rackets, commanded relationships with corrupt politicians and police, commanded the national criminal networks, while black gangsters operated in the margins with whatever territory white gangsters didn't desire or couldn't effectively command. What Capone was proposing violated these conventions, treating black gangsters as autonomous operators worthy of negotiating with, incorporating them into the national criminal syndicate, establishing arrangements that acknowledged their effectiveness and their entitlement to command their own territories. The backlash hazard was severe. If other Italian bosses discovered Capone was negotiating with black gangsters, that he was treating them as associates rather than as subordinates to be crushed, they might perceive Capone as weak, might challenge his leadership, might refuse to honor agreements he'd established. The political hazard was equally severe. Politicians who accepted bribes from Italian gangsters might refuse to be corrupted by black gangsters, might perceive collaboration between white and black criminals as threatening to racial hierarchies, might withdraw their protection if they discovered integrated criminal operations. This meant the understanding, if it was to function, had to remain concealed, had to be known only to the top leadership of both white and black criminal syndicates, had to be maintained through informal understandings rather than through public declarations, had to preserve the appearance of racial segregation even while establishing practical collaboration. After Bumpy Jonson contacted Stephanie St. Clair from the Lexington Hotel to explain Capone's counterproposal, after St. Clair considered the offer and granted Jonson authority to accept on Harlem's behalf, the genuine labor of constructing the understanding commenced. Over the subsequent several days, Capone, Jonson, Guzik, and Nitti developed the detailed framework. Territory. Black gangsters would possess exclusive command over gambling, prostitution, and other rackets in predominantly black neighborhoods across the United States. White gangsters would consent not to compete in these territories, would not attempt to muscle in on established black operations, would honor the territorial boundaries. Tribute, black gangsters would compensate 15% of gross profits from gambling and numbers operations to Capone's syndicate, and later, after the commission was established, to the appropriate Italian family in each municipality. This tribute would be compensated quarterly, would be enforced through the threat that failure to compensate would culminate in loss of protection and in white gangsters being permitted to move into black territories. Protection. In exchange for tribute, Capone's syndicate would prevent other white gangsters from assaulting black operations, would utilize its political connections to guarantee that police raids on black gambling operations would be minimal or coordinated in advance to permit operators to avoid arrests, would furnish backing if black gangsters confronted challenges from competitors or from law enforcement. Knowledge sharing. As Capone had proposed, there would be technical collaboration where black numbers operators would instruct Italian gangsters the sophisticated systems developed in Harlem, and where both factions would share intelligence about law enforcement activities, about corrupt officials who could be bribed, about opportunities for expansion. Dispute resolution. A mechanism would be established for resolving disputes between black and white gangsters. Bumpy Jonson, operating from Chicago, would serve as liaison and arbiter, would coordinate between Capone's syndicate and black gangsters in various municipalities, would labor to resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. Secrecy. The understanding would be maintained secret from the public, from most members of both black and white criminal syndicates, and would be known only to top leadership who needed to know in order to enforce the agreements. This framework was sophisticated, more sophisticated than most legitimate business arrangements in 1928, and demonstrated that Capone was serious about establishing sustainable organization rather than simply extracting short-term tribute. Implementing the understanding confronted several major challenges. Convincing other white gangsters. Capone needed to convince Italian bosses in New York, Detroit, and other major municipalities that the understanding made business logic, that honoring black territories and accepting tribute was more lucrative than attempting to conquer those territories through violence. This required Capone to utilize his prestige and his influence. He was the most successful gangster in America in 1928, was widely admired for his business acumen, and could argue credibly that his Chicago operations proved cooperation was more lucrative than constant warfare. Convincing black gangsters. Bumpy Jonson and Stephanie St. Clair needed to convince black operators in other municipalities that compensating tribute to white gangsters was an acceptable price for independence and protection, that the understanding wouldn't simply be another form of exploitation. This required demonstrating that the understanding furnished genuine advantages, that police raids decreased, that white gangsters actually remained out of black territories, that disputes were resolved fairly, that the tribute payments resulted in genuine protection rather than simply being extortion. Maintaining secrecy. The understanding had to remain concealed enough that it wouldn't provoke backlash from white society that would perceive collaboration between white and black criminals as threatening, but had to be known widely enough within criminal syndicates that people would actually follow the regulations. This required careful management of intelligence. Top leaders knew the details. Mid-level operators knew only that there were arrangements that needed to be honored. Street-level criminals knew only that certain territories were prohibited without comprehending why. Preventing defections. Both factions needed to prevent individual gangsters from violating the agreement. White gangsters, who presumed they could make quick revenue by muscling into black territories. Black gangsters who presumed they could avoid compensating tribute and wouldn't confront consequences. This required enforcement mechanisms. Violators would be punished by their own syndicates rather than by the other faction, preventing violations from escalating into interorganizational conflicts. Through late 1928 and into 1929, the understanding was implemented. Bumpy Jonson remained in Chicago for over a year, residing in a safe house furnished by Capone's syndicate, assembling regularly with Capone and his counselors, coordinating with black gangsters in New York, Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, and other municipalities. Stephanie St. Clair dispatched 3 of her finest numbers operators to Chicago to instruct Capone's people the sophisticated systems Harlem had developed. The betting slips, the collection systems, the calculation methods, the payout frameworks that rendered Harlem's policy game so successful. Tribute payments commenced. Harlem's operations compensated their first quarterly tribute in early 1929, approximately $750,000, representing 15% of $5 million in quarterly gross profits. The currency was delivered in cash to one of Capone's collectors, was deposited in banks Capone commanded, was laundered through legitimate enterprises. The violence decreased. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters who'd been battling for command of Harlem were informed through channels that aren't entirely clear historically, but that apparently involved Capone communicating through New York's Italian bosses that Harlem was now under protection, and that attempts to conquer it would be perceived as violations of arrangements Capone had established. Schultz retreated, recognizing that battling Capone's protected territories wasn't worth the cost. The system expanded. Black gangsters in other municipalities discovered the Harlem understanding, reached out to Bumpy Jonson to negotiate similar bargains for their territories, and gradually, a network of protected black gambling operations was established across major American municipalities. By mid-1929, the Capone-Jonson understanding was functioning smoothly, was generating millions in tribute for Capone's syndicate while furnishing stability and independence for black gangsters, and was demonstrating that collaboration across racial boundaries could function even in an epoch of rigid segregation. The Capone-Jonson understanding had consequences neither gentleman anticipated when they established the bargain. Consequence 1. The Commission adopted the model asterisk. When Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky established the Commission in 1931 to organize Italian-American crime families nationally, they adopted elements of the Capone-Jonson model. Territorial exclusivity, where each family would command its territory without interference from other families, reducing conflicts and increasing stability. Tribute and sharing arrangements where families would share profits from certain operations, would compensate percentages for protection or collaboration, establishing financial interdependence that discouraged warfare. Dispute resolution mechanisms, where the Commission would resolve conflicts between families before they escalated to violence, furnishing formal framework for what Capone and Jonson had established informally. The model developed to manage white-black criminal relationships became the template for organizing white criminal syndicates, demonstrating the innovation had broader applicability than its original objective. Consequence 2. Black organized crime achieved stability. The protection arrangements permitted black gangsters to construct more stable and more sophisticated operations. Without constant warfare with white gangsters, black operators could invest in improving their operations, could develop superior systems, could accumulate capital that would be utilized to expand into legitimate enterprises. Numbers operations flourished. By the 1930s and 1940s, black-controlled policy gambling in Harlem, on Chicago's South Side, in Detroit's black neighborhoods generated tens of millions annually, much of which remained in black communities rather than being extracted by white gangsters. Some black gangsters became prosperous. Figures like Stephanie St. Clair, Bumpy Jonson himself, and others accumulated significant prosperity that they utilized to support black enterprises, to furnish loans that black people couldn't obtain from white-controlled banks, to establish economic infrastructure in black communities. The understanding that had commenced as tribute to white gangsters evolved into a mechanism that permitted black economic development in areas where legitimate economic opportunities were severely limited by discrimination. Consequence 3. Bumpy Jonson became power broker *. Bumpy Jonson's role as liaison between white and black criminal syndicates rendered him one of the most powerful black gangsters in America. He knew both worlds, comprehended how Italian gangsters operated, comprehended the concerns and opportunities of black gangsters, could navigate between the two worlds in ways few other people could. He possessed Capone's backing, and later, after Capone's imprisonment, possessed backing from the Commission. This protection rendered Jonson almost untouchable, granted him authority to resolve disputes, rendered him essential to maintaining the understanding. He became mentor. Younger black gangsters learned from Jonson how to operate within the system, how to navigate relationships with white organized crime, how to construct operations that were lucrative but that didn't threaten the territorial arrangements. When Bumpy Jonson eventually returned to Harlem in the 1930s after Capone's imprisonment, he became one of the most powerful and most respected figures in Harlem's underworld, ruling for decades until his death in 1968. His power was built fundamentally on the relationship he'd established with Al Capone in 1928. Consequence 4. The secret remained protected. Perhaps most remarkably, the details of the Capone-Jonson understanding remained concealed for decades. Neither gentleman publicized it. Capone never spoke publicly about negotiating with black gangsters. Jonson never claimed credit for negotiating the understanding, both gentlemen comprehending that revealing it would harm both factions. The Commission protected the secret. When the Commission was established, the territorial arrangements with black gangsters were incorporated into the Commission's regulations, but the history of how those arrangements developed was not widely discussed. Historians missed it. For decades, organized crime historians focused on Italian-American crime families, largely ignored black organized crime, and didn't recognize there had been formal, though secret, collaboration between white and black criminals dating back to the Prohibition epoch. Only recently, as historians have examined black organized crime more carefully, as they've analyzed financial records and interviewed the few surviving participants, has the extent of the Capone-Jonson understanding become clear, revealing a chapter of American crime history that was deliberately hidden. Al Capone's conviction for tax evasion in 1931 and his subsequent imprisonment could have destroyed the understanding, but instead it was absorbed into the Commission's framework. When Capone went to federal prison in 1931, Frank Nitti assumed command of the Chicago outfit and maintained the arrangements with black gangsters Capone had established. Bumpy Jonson continued serving as liaison, but now coordinated with Nitti rather than with Capone directly. When the commission was established in 1931, the territorial arrangements with black gangsters were incorporated into the commission's national organization. Each commission family would collect tribute from black gambling operations in their territories, would furnish protection, would honor the boundaries that had been established. The understanding proved remarkably durable. Through the 1930s and 1940s, black gambling operations continued compensating tribute to commission families, continued receiving protection, continued operating with substantial independence in their territories. Through the 1950s and 1960s, even as the civil rights movement challenged segregation in legitimate society, the criminal underworld maintained its racial boundaries and its tribute arrangements, demonstrating that criminal syndicates can sometimes be more conservative than legitimate society about maintaining established practices. Into the 1970s, elements of the understanding persisted, though by then heroin trafficking had largely replaced gambling as the most lucrative criminal enterprise, and the dynamics between white and black criminals were shifting as black criminals became more independent and less prepared to accept subordinate status. The Capone-Jonson understanding finally terminated not through violence, but through obsolescence. By the 1980s and 1990s, federal prosecutions had severely damaged the commission families, had eliminated most top leadership, had disrupted the national organization that had maintained the territorial arrangements. By the 1980s, black gangs involved in crack cocaine trafficking operated independently, didn't compensate tribute to Italian families, didn't honor the old territorial boundaries, represented a new generation that possessed no memory of or loyalty to arrangements established in the Prohibition epoch. Drug trafficking was more lucrative than gambling had ever been, established opportunities for independent operators who didn't need commission protection, rendered the old tribute system seem unnecessary and outdated. By the early 21st century, the Capone-Jonson understanding was a historical artifact remembered only by crime historians, and by a few surviving old-timers who'd lived through the epoch, when Bumpy Jonson and Al Capone had reorganized American organized crime along boundaries that acknowledged racial realities while establishing collaboration that advantaged both factions. The account of how Al Capone and Bumpy Jonson negotiated the understanding that would govern American organized crime for decades reveals several uncomfortable truths about American history. The lesson about race and crime. The Capone-Jonson understanding demonstrated that criminal syndicates can be pragmatic about race in ways legitimate society isn't. When collaboration is lucrative, criminals will collaborate across racial boundaries even when social conventions forbid such collaboration. But criminal collaboration still reflects racial hierarchies. The understanding didn't establish equality. It established subordination that was less exploitative than alternatives, but that still maintained white gangsters in superior position and black gangsters in subordinate position. This establishes complex legacy. On one hand, the understanding furnished black gangsters with independence and protection they might not have achieved independently. On the other hand, it institutionalized a tribute system where black communities' gambling revenue was partially extracted by white criminals. The lesson about secrecy. The understanding secrecy for so many decades demonstrates both factions possessed incentives to conceal the truth. White gangsters didn't want to be perceived as collaborating with black criminals. Black gangsters didn't want to be perceived as subordinate to white criminals. Both factions benefited from maintaining the fiction they operated independently. Concealed history is often more interesting than known history. The conventional narrative of American organized crime focused on Italian-American families and largely ignored black organized crime, missed the collaborative arrangements that actually existed, established simplified account that was easier to relate but that was incomplete. Truth eventually emerges. Even secrets protected for decades eventually become known as historians examine new sources, interview surviving participants, piece together the concealed arrangements that shaped history. The lesson about Capone. The understanding reveals Al Capone as more complex than the simple thug of popular imagination. He was capable of innovation, recognizing that collaboration with black gangsters could be more lucrative than conflict required. Seeing past social prejudices most white Americans in 1928 couldn't see past. He was pragmatic about race. While there's no evidence Capone was particularly progressive on racial matters, he was prepared to treat black gangsters as associates when it served his business interests, suggesting profit motive could overcome prejudice, at least in criminal contexts. His legacy is more complicated. Capone is remembered primarily for violence and for tax evasion conviction, but his greatest achievement might have been establishing organizational frameworks, including arrangements with black gangsters, that brought stability to American organized crime and that persisted long after his imprisonment. The lesson about Jonson. Bumpy Jonson's role reveals him as one of the most significant but least known figures in American crime history. He was strategist and diplomat. Negotiating with Capone required courage, but also required sophistication about how to present Harlem's proposition in ways that would appeal to Capone's business sense. He became bridge between worlds. His years in Chicago learning Capone's operations, his role as liaison coordinating between white and black criminals, rendered him essential to making the understanding function. His legacy in Harlem. When Jonson returned to Harlem and ruled its underworld for decades, his power was based fundamentally on the relationships he'd built with white organized crime, on the protection those relationships furnished, demonstrating that success in the criminal underworld required navigation skills as much as violence. If you found this exploration of the secret alliance between Al Capone and Bumpy Jonson compelling, like and subscribe for more investigations into hidden organized crime history. Share this with anyone interested in the Prohibition epoch, in the relationship between race and organized crime, or in comprehending how criminal syndicates actually operated rather than how popular culture portrays them. Comment below. Why do you think this understanding remained concealed for so long? How does learning about collaboration between white and black criminals transform your comprehension of Prohibition-era organized crime? What does it reveal about American society that criminal syndicates could collaborate across racial boundaries when legitimate society couldn't? Until next time, remember, history is more complicated than the simplified narratives we relate. Al Capone wasn't merely a violent thug. He was a businessman who recognized that collaboration could be more lucrative than conflict, who was prepared to work with black gangsters when doing so served his interests, who established organizational innovations that shaped American crime for generations. Bumpy Jonson wasn't merely a Harlem gangster. He was a negotiator who secured independence for black criminals across America, who constructed relationships with white organized crime that furnished protection and stability, who became one of the most powerful crime figures of the 20th century despite operating in an epoch of rigid racial segregation. Their secret alliance, negotiated in a hotel dining chamber in Chicago in 1928, reorganized American organized crime in ways historians are only now beginning to comprehend, established arrangements that persisted for decades, and demonstrated that when revenue is at stake, people will discover ways to collaborate even across the deepest social divisions. The twist: that Capone had been planning the same reorganization Harlem proposed, that he perceived black gangsters as potential associates rather than merely as competitors to be crushed, reveals a sophistication about criminal organization that contradicts the simple violence-focused narrative of Prohibition-era crime. And the consequences, the stability it established, the prosperity it permitted black criminals to accumulate, the organizational model it furnished for the Commission, demonstrate this secret gathering had impacts extending far beyond the immediate question of who would command Harlem's gambling.